Hello, everyone. My name is Whitney. I'm the Adult Services Manager here at the library. Just here to welcome you to this program with Matthew Shumar. This is the first program of Love Your Alley, the Love Your Alley initiative. We're so happy to be partnering with Love Your Alley again. And this is the first of 3 programs here. Here, hold on. So today's a Thursday, but the next 2 Wednesdays will be Love Your Alley programs at 7 o'clock. There's Know Your Niche, Right Plant, Right Place in your residential garden. That's next week. And then the following Wednesday, it's Birdscaping, Gardening for Our Feathered Friends. So again, thank you to the Love Your Alley Committee for planning such a wonderful program lineup. And I'm going to go ahead and turn the mic over to Rebecca. Oh, actually, I just thought of 2 announcements. So the library technically closes at 8, but this presentation might go past that. So after this year, so if you are interested in harvesting seeds, we'll be having a class in August, but please check that out. And now I'm going to turn the mic over to Rebecca. So thank you.
Thanks, Whitney. Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Ness with Green Bexley's Love Your Alley. There's 2 other Love Your Alley committee members here tonight. We have Susan Cowden and Kelsey Sense of Love Your Alley since January, maybe a little sooner, maybe all year, who knows, but officially since January. So tonight is Every Yard Counts, Personal Contributions to Bird Conservation with Matthew Shumar. We're very happy to have Matthew kicking off our 4th year of Love Your Alley, and this year it's all about the birds. This year we're focused on birds. And the Love Your Alley initiative is about restoring habitat as a community, so thank you all for being here. It takes all of us to restore the land, so thank you for working with us. By the end of this May, we will have distributed 4,900 plants since 2021. I currently have 1,500 plants sitting in my driveway right now. They're shaded and well watered. So, and in 2023, we banded together with local schools, working with over 200 students from Bexley High School and Columbus School for Girls. And we're continuing these efforts this month. And now in May, and we'd love for you to join us for these plant installations. We have 4 plant installations throughout the month of May, starting on Sunday. And Whitney so kindly told us about some of the other Love Your Alley events. We have a couple of other ones that are not taking. Oh, another Love Your Alley committee member, just 2 are here. Liz and Carrie are here, and they've been planning with us since January. Sorry, I didn't see you back there. Okay, so we also have at Bexley City Hall on this Sunday, May 5th, we have Bexley Community Backyards Workshop, where you can learn about backyard conservation and you can earn a voucher towards a rain barrel or native plants. And then on Saturday, May 11th, we have the Love Your Alley Festival, and this is my favorite day of the year, and I really hope you'll join me. This is the date. We have lots of educational opportunities, bird-themed crafts, native landscapers, music, food from Portia's Cafe and J-Pops. We'll be raffling off native shrubs, and there are lots and lots and lots of free native plants. We also have a hands-on gardening skills class with Josh Zing, and that will be in the Alley of the Future. And the Alley of the Future is Mayor Kessler's initiative. The alley is, it's always hard to explain where an alley is, isn't it? Because it's 4 streets, so bear with me. So it's between Stanwood and Remington and Broad and Denver. And there's about, 35 houses on that block. And our aspect of it is we're planting about 20 native gardens in the alley, and we're painting 9 murals. I'm not painting them. Professional artists are painting them, and Susan's organizing that. And enjoy that alley in June when we're finished and the plants are in and all the murals are done. So, Matthew Shumar. So Matthew is based in the School of Environment and Natural Resources at The Ohio State University, where he is program coordinator of the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative, a collaboration of nonprofit groups, businesses, state and federal government agencies advancing avian conservation in Ohio and the region. Prior to working with OBCI, He was the project coordinator and co-editor for the second atlas of breeding birds in Ohio. Matthew's research interests include landscape ecology, and in particular, anthropogenic effects of neotropical migrant songbirds. He's also interested in engaging the public in community science efforts and exploring new opportunities for collaborative efforts between academia, agency professionals, and amateur ecologists. Matthew also runs a private research station with the Association of Field Ornithologists, an international professional society dedicated to the study of birds and their habitats.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming inside on a really nice and warm spring day, especially as we kick off Bird Ohio Day, and this coming week and a half will be the biggest week in American birding up at the lake. There's lots of great opportunities here for birding as well, so thanks for joining us tonight. As you heard from probably too long of an introduction that I provided, I'm an ornithologist by trade, but these days I spend most of my time in the office working on partner coordination and conservation planning. So what I want to talk to you about today is how everybody can get involved in that conservation planning and how it's really essential if we're dedicated to preserving bird populations. So with a show of hands, I want to start out. How many people in here consider themselves birders? A couple, and I see a few shaking their hands like maybe. All right. How many people have bird feeders in their yard? All right, that's a better representative of birders. Anybody, if you love birds, you are a birder. So hopefully when I ask this question, how many birders, I see lots of hands go up. It's not a professional or niche hobby. So I want to start off a little bit to set the stage, do what I do, and some of the recommendations that I'm making. You may have heard a news publication that came out a few years ago. In 2019, there was a research paper published in the journal Science, so top-tier scientific journal, documenting the widespread decline in North American avifauna. And these are across lots of different groups of birds. And this is somewhat alarming. But before I move on and go into some specifics about some of those declines, I do want to preface this with maybe a little glimmer of hope. And so the image on the right here, you'll see that there's a bar, and the blue line is essentially how much of that species group is left since 1970. And you see that most of these, the blue is shorter than the entire bar, so it's representing a decline. But for a couple of these, so native resident species, so non-migratory species, so think about things like tufted titmouse here in Ohio, and waterfowl have actually increased populations during that same time period. And so if we're interested in songbirds, for instance, we can maybe take a look at what has been done with waterfowl. And really, waterfowl are one of the great success stories for North American wildlife conservation. So organizations like Ducks Unlimited and through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Duck Stamp, we've done a lot to restore wetlands that were lost across North America. And as a result, waterfowl populations have boomed in the last several decades. So there is hope. We can actually create positive change by it first takes an understanding and an acknowledgement of what's going on, and then taking steps to address that. So let's start out with some hope, and we'll come back to that as I talk about some of the things that we can get involved with as individuals. So if we take a closer look or deeper dive at those avian population trends, so essentially 2.9 billion with a B birds gone from the North American landscape since 1970. That's a pretty staggering decline in pretty much many of our lifetimes in this room. If we put that into context for specific birds, we can think about 2 out of every 5 Baltimore Orioles gone, no longer here, that were here or there. And so if you're interested in this, you can get more information at 3billionbirds.org. Again, this is all based on research that was published in Science in 2019. And there are a lot of reasons for this, and we're going to get into some of those reasons. First of all, that comes behind a rapidly developing landscape. We're making change, and we're making change pretty quickly. And so the map that I have here on the left never shows up all that well, but hopefully you can see this pink on the map. And that pink is representative of a growth in urban land cover between the year 2000 and 2019. So we're just expanding outward. And that's pretty much around all of the urban centers throughout Ohio. There is a substantial amount of growth in northeastern Ohio, particularly around suburban development throughout this region. And this is happening across North America. And so first, it's this developing landscape as this backdrop. And so we need to think about, okay, how do we deal with that? How do we manage it? Well, we can talk to our wildlife agencies and our park districts about what are you doing, but I think we also need to take a look inward, because who owns all of that land? We do, essentially. And so most of Ohio is privately owned, almost 96% of it. So all of the red on the map here is private lands. The white on the map is our public lands. And so, as individuals, we have a lot of responsibility and a lot of potential to do good for wildlife conservation. So how do we do that? Well, first, let's go back to that public land, and that's to support scientifically informed, active habitat management on public lands. This can be a somewhat controversial subject. A lot of people think that keep your hands off, that's the best approach. We live in a landscape now where there are 12 million Ohioans, and we have drastically altered the landscape from what it looked like historically. There are invasive species all over the place, and the impact on these wild lands from our footprint is felt everywhere. And so the lack of management in many cases is a management decision. And a lot of places that I've seen that have been attempted to be preserved that didn't have a restoration beforehand usually wind up being full of invasive species and pretty low quality habitat. So the first is to support scientifically informed management on public lands for wildlife. The second is to treat all private lands as manageable habitat. We have this mindset that there's the city and there are the wildlands, and we need to get kids out of the school and into the parks and into the wildlands. Like, no, we need to bring the wildlands and the park to them. And I know many of you are embracing that philosophy through this very program that you have over the course of the next couple weeks. And so we can do quite a bit. So literally treat everything as manageable habitat. So every square inch that's out there, let's take a look at that and assess the good that it does and potentially the harm that it does as well. Yep, seriously. Treat it all as habitat. We also have to think about our mindsets too, and even as professional ecologists, we find ourselves sometimes trapped in these ecological and conservation paradigms. So Partners in Flight is a network of organizations much like the one that I coordinate here in Ohio. And this is an international group of organizations across the Americas, so both North and South America, made up of agencies like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and groups like the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and others working on bird conservation. In 2004, they published their first land bird conservation plan. And this was an attempt to look at not just the game species like waterfowl and turkey that we spent a lot of time in the past as wildlife biologists managing for natural resources, but seriously to look at all the species and find out how those populations are doing and what we can do. This was updated and published in 2016. If you take a look at that very first iteration of the guide, you'll find that almost all of the subject matter is focused on breeding habitats and the breeding ecology of these species. And in fact, we have that sort of mindset embedded in our own language. We often talk about our birds that leave us for the wintertime to go somewhere else. And as you'll see in a minute, they're not really our birds. If anything, we're borrowing them for just a little bit of time. And so there really wasn't any discussion whatsoever about what these species need during migration, and then also what they need during the overwintering period. There's a little bit of language 20-some years ago about what these species need on the wintering grounds, but that has been expanded greatly as we learn more and more about where these species even are. If you look at most older field guides, so go to the library, pull up an older published field guide for birds, and you'll find that many of these migratory birds, their overwintering range is a big blob over South America. I can assure you that those species don't occur everywhere in South America. It's just that we didn't really have a refined sense of where and when they occurred until recently. And for some species, we're still continuing to learn more and more information as eBird becomes more popular and birding is becoming more of an activity in places like Argentina and Brazil and Peru. And so, there have been some updates, but we still kind of find ourselves trapped in some of these conservation paradigms. The biggest one is how we treat urban landscapes. So even in the updated land bird conservation plan, you're going to see urban habitats primarily thought of as a negative. And on one side of the coin, that's correct. There are a lot of threats and a lot of dangers in urban landscapes. But we don't necessarily talk about how to improve those habitats. The birds are going to come here whether we want them to or not. We can put up signs around the city that says, birds go round, it's better over here. They're going to come here. And for many reasons, they may actually come here in greater numbers because of things like artificial light. Most migratory songbirds are nocturnal migrants and have a strong attraction to light on the landscape. So cities can actually draw in an unusually high number of migrants. The result is that these migrant land birds end up in downtown areas where there isn't a lot of great habitat and there are more threats. And so we need to think about this landscape, Bexley, downtown Columbus, as habitat. And how do we manage that habitat for these birds? Because they're going to use it. And so, an example of that is the veery. Has anyone ever seen veery? We got a couple here, yeah. So this is a migratory bird. It's a fairly uncommon localized breeder in the state of Ohio. So the map on the right are the results from the second atlas of breeding birds in Ohio. So these are all the locations where there was some breeding evidence for this species. You can see they're pretty much a northeastern Ohio specialist. This is more of a boreal breeding species. We do find it further south in the Appalachians, but for most of Ohio, they're not here. So if we take the sort of historic mindset and think about the breeding habitats, well, we can't do a whole lot for this species probably in Ohio because elevation's too low, it's not the right type of forest. However, this is, if you go to ebird.org, so this is a site where bird watchers submit their observations, and you pull up the map for veery, it looks like this. It's quite a bit different than the previous map. They're pretty much everywhere. The difference is that, this is throughout the calendar year. And so if we think about when veery occurs in Ohio, it is primarily as a transient migrant. So they're just passing through Ohio as they're coming from their overwintering habitat in Brazil to breeding grounds in Canada. And there are a lot of veery that come through here. If you really get the bug and start birding, veery is one that you can definitely see in Ohio. And in fact, probably in the next week and a half to 2 weeks, we're going to start seeing veeries show up. So I encourage you, get up early in the morning, go hit some of those ravines or woodlots this time of year over the course of the next week, and you're going to hear veer, veer, and you're going to hear their wonderful song because we get a lot of transient migrant veeries in Ohio. That means we have a lot of potential and a lot of responsibility for this species as a transient migrant. So they're coming through Ohio. If they're going to reach their breeding grounds in Canada, we have to make sure that it's pretty good here in Ohio for them to make that journey. And so I want to talk again, I mentioned earlier that we've often called most birds our birds and they leave us for the winter. This map, which you can view maps like this for hundreds of species on ebird.org, if you click on the science tab, I encourage you will spend weeks just staring at these maps because I have, and I find this particular species really interesting. First off, you'll notice that there are several weeks of the year where they're just not there. I can assure you they're not disappearing into a portal into another dimension. They're there, we just don't really know where. Again, so if you go to a field guide, go up to the library, grab the field guide of birds of eastern North America, you're going to see a giant blob over pretty much 2/3 of South America. Turns out what we're learning is that this species has two discrete overwintering locations. At the start of our winter, they fly to southern Brazil, and as the season changes, drought conditions increase in those areas, they actually move further north into the Amazon basin. And so there's two very discrete overwintering habitats. And then they make the jump through the US to breeding grounds. And I've outlined Ohio a little bit here for context. You can see they don't stay on the breeding grounds very long. So even Canada can't call this their bird. This is Brazil's bird. We don't exactly have a great idea when and where, but we're starting to learn about that, and that's coming through bird watchers sharing their observations. So I can't tell you how many hours I've spent combing through eBird and staring at these maps. They're so fascinating to look at, and I encourage you to go to ebird.org and click on the Science tab. So if we want to provide good quality habitat for veery and other transient migratory birds that are heading to boreal Canada to nest, we want to have a good bird-friendly yard, right? We love seeing these birds in our yard. What exactly does that mean, though, to have a bird-friendly yard? Does it look like this, where we have a shepherd's hook out there and a couple feeders? In reality, it probably looks a little more like this. We've got lots of cover. In many cases, this can sometimes be a trap. It can be a Cooper's hawk feeder for a lot of songbirds. There's no cover in this area whatsoever, and it's not great during the breeding season. I tell people that bird feeders are for us. They're not necessarily for the birds. We put bird feeders out to draw them into viewing distance, and they're great for that. However, they don't really provide a huge boost in terms of food and nutrition. During the breeding season, most species don't eat seeds. They switch to insects and arthropods, and so there are a small number of species, finches and house sparrows, that will continue to come into your feeders, but most everything else is going out and they're eating caterpillars and butterflies and all kinds of moths and stuff that has a lot of protein and a lot of nutrition. Even hummingbirds, the females are primarily fly catching and eating spiders during the breeding season. It's typically only the males that are coming into the feeders at that time of year. And so what I try to do is steer people away from having a yard that looks like this. If they really love birds and want to make a difference, let's try to get something a little bit closer to this. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology published this a few years ago, right after that paper in Science came out, documenting that massive decline in North American avifauna. And they summarized this in 7 simple steps, which I think are fantastic recommendations. We'll go through some of these that are yard-focused, but not all of them. So for tonight, we're going to talk about the 4 of these steps that are really concentrated on your backyard or your alley, things that you can do there. So things like citizen science, great if you're a bird watcher, hopefully you're contributing to eBird. Even if you only know how to identify a couple birds in your backyard, you should also be contributing to eBird. Everybody can make a big difference there. Using less plastic. There's a lot of research. I could have entire lectures on the effects of microplastics on wildlife, and particularly birds. I've got a colleague that I work with who's researching this right now. Shade coffee and how important that is for overwintering migrant songbirds. Again, these could be entire lectures unto themselves. We're going to focus on the things that are yard-based, essentially. And so that's making our windows safe, keeping cats indoors, using native plants, which I know is a big part of this festival, and avoiding pesticides. And so I'm going to start with the elephant in the room. We're going to talk about cats for a minute. This is a pretty straightforward and a pretty easy one, actually. If we talk about the direct threats to birds, so human-induced direct threats, number 1 is predation by free-ranging domestic and feral cats. undisputed. So between 1.4 and 3.7 billion, again with a B, birds are predated each year in the US alone by free-ranging cats. They are not native to the North American landscape. They serve as vectors for diseases such as rabies, hookworms, toxoplasmosis, and TNR, which is often pushed, is not an effective strategy. They assume a closed population, and no populations are closed. If anything, they can exacerbate some of the issues. Now, when I've given this talk before, I sometimes get stuff thrown at me, people yell, it's a wild subject. I will say, though, that I am a cat lover. I love cats. Cats live with me. I'm roommates with them, and so, you know, I say this because it's good for the cats to keep them indoors as well. I have multiple cats. Right now I'm down to one because aging cats sort of aged out, and this particular one kind of likes being a loner. She doesn't like roommates so much. But cats can live really wonderful, enriched lives indoors all the time. So if you have a cat, please, please, if you love birds, keep them indoors. If you really want to get your cat outdoor enrichment and you have the space, catios are a wonderful idea. And so you're basically creating a screened-in porch for a cat. I've seen some really gorgeous examples of catios, and they're really awesome. There are some companies that sort of make prefab ones, but it's pretty easy to build a DIY catio as well. And so you can, if you're really intent on getting your cat outdoor enrichment, sort of separate them from native wildlife. And I encourage you to do so. So I'll leave it at that. I'd be happy to talk to folks afterwards if they're very passionate about this. We do have information on the OBCI website, and I'll make sure that URL is up at the end of the presentation today. There's a lot of synthesized research on the effects of cats on native wildlife, and some recorded webinars on there that you can watch as well. Make windows safer. This is a big one, and I'll talk a little bit about our Lights Out program. Has anyone ever heard of Lights Out? It's a sort of a global effort to reduce bird building collisions. And we'll talk about how you can actually make a huge difference in this at home. So if we sort of, again, I'm going in order now for direct human-caused population declines for birds. Window collisions is number 2. Somewhere between 365 million and nearly 1 billion birds are killed in the US each year from building collisions. I coordinate a number of Lights Out programs here in the state of Ohio. We have one in Columbus. So I have volunteers that walk around downtown Columbus every morning looking for dead and injured birds. We do it in Akron, Canton, Cleveland, Toledo, Cincinnati, and Dayton as well. We don't do collision monitoring in all of those cities. Right now, we're surveying in 4 of them. And since 2017, our volunteers have salvaged 20,000 birds through these efforts. And so just walking around the most downtown area every day during spring and fall migration, and we found around 20,000 birds. Some of the species have surprised us. And again, I could give probably 2 nights talk about migratory ecology and Lights Out, but I'm going to try to synthesize it here pretty quickly. Things like Connecticut warbler. So if you're a birder at all, Connecticut warbler, your ears probably perked up. It's an elusive, skulky bird. They're really hard to see. A lot of people go their entire lives without seeing Connecticut warbler, but they come through Ohio. The Cleveland Museum of Natural History had 6 Connecticut warblers in their entire collection up until 2017. Since then, we've found 45 just in downtown Cleveland. So it tells us a lot about the ecology of these species, but just to let you know that it is a serious issue. And the sort of emphasis of this issue and the program is on our downtown areas, the most urbanized of our urban areas. But in reality, most of the collisions are happening away from that downtown area. They're just concentrated, and we find them easily there. 44% of bird building collisions happen at our homes. Another 55% in low-rise commercial, and only about 1% actually happen in those high-rise buildings in downtown areas. So This number is kind of depressing and scary, especially as our volunteers walk around. These are photos from our Columbus and Cleveland programs. And so we've got Wilson's warbler, and it looks like a female magnolia warbler there. We find all kinds of great birds, unfortunately, in this program. The flip side is that we can actually do quite a lot and have a big impact by looking at our homes and our windows as well. A lot of these programs, Audubon does it. We talk about putting all this gorgeous native vegetation in our yards, and we often have these really nice, big, reflective picture windows as well. That can sometimes create an ecological trap. Birds haven't evolved with glass or reflections, and so what happens is we create all this beautiful habitat, we sort of draw birds into this oasis, and many of them hit windows, unfortunately. So every time I talk about native plants, and so I'm sort of starting this with glass, you should also consider looking at your windows and treating them as well. And we have some information on the website about things you can do, some really inexpensive temporary things that you can do too to reduce window collisions. And this is really important. I think if we want to do a lot for bird conservation, we really have to put a lot of emphasis on this migratory period. So what's happening right now and over the course of the next month, and then again in September and October. So this infographic was published in a paper about 6 years ago, and they were able to estimate the biomass of migratory birds moving across the Americas. And so in the spring, we have 3.5 billion birds coming from Central and South America into the US. And of those, 2.6 billion are going to keep going to these really lush breeding grounds in boreal Canada. And so we've got this massive movement of animals overhead every night that most people are oblivious to. This is a wild ecological phenomenon that I think just goes by most people. If you could go out at night and avoid the traffic noise and all that, you would hear call notes of birds flying overhead, thrushes. You can actually, on a really well-lit moonlight night, actually do a moon count, they call them, and watch birds as they cross the moon face. It's fascinating. This number is even greater in the fall because, anyone want to take a guess? What's that? Breeding, yeah. So there are all these babies in the population now making their very first migratory flight. And so 4 billion birds are going to come to the US from Canada. They're going to pick up some friends, and 4.7 billion are going to continue on to Central and South America. And so birds are moving constantly. Again, go to ebird.org, click on that science tab, and just stare at those maps of birds moving across the landscape. They're really fascinating. So birds are always moving. Why, though? It's energetically taxing. There's a high risk of mortality. And the reason that they do it is to take advantage of this wonderful temperate and boreal forest that is available during the breeding season. So there's high risk, but there's really high reward. Researchers have been studying this gorgeous bird, the black-throated blue warbler, at Hubbard Brook for over 20 years. And they found that mortality is 15 times higher during migration than it is during breeding or overwintering. So if we want to do something for species like the black-throated blue warbler, we have to address those threats during the migratory periods and make sure that we have really good habitat and we're reducing some of those threats. And so, let's see here. There we go. The issue that these birds face, commonly more and more, is reflected green space. To a bird, this looks like more green space. And so they see it, they fly to it. Just this morning, I had a graduate student come into my office on campus, and she said, "There's a bird outside." I went out there, and there was a house wren that had hit the window of Cotman Hall, where I work, unfortunately. And it went into the freezer, and it'll go to the Museum of Biological Diversity. And it's an all too uncommon case. It is happening in many of your yards, but it's getting scavenged. It's falling out of areas where you don't see it. Most collisions go undetected. I think it was estimated from a few studies that less than 20% of window collisions are actually found or detected after that. So these are some photos from 2 sites in Cleveland where we get a lot of collisions. It's very common. So this is common. Look around at all the new construction going up. Almost all of it is glass curtain facade, especially on medical campuses that are expanding. We actually have a couple architects in our Lights Out Columbus program who have been great to chat with, and they've given me wonderful insight on why some of those trends are happening. At least in the medical field, all these new buildings are going up with glass facades to increase the sunlight for patients, for mental health and healing, and I get that. There are bird-safe glass products now more readily available on the market, and many cities are developing bird-friendly ordinances and bird-safe construction legislation as well. And this is in front of a glass walkway or a hand railing where an ovenbird hit. And we get a lot of ovenbirds in our collision monitoring. And so what we need to do if we want to make a big impact for bird populations is to make our windows safer. Again, 25 to 50% of collisions don't leave any evidence whatsoever. It's really hard to get good photos. This happens sometimes, but researchers, we have to email each other. Do you have a really good photo of a dander on a window where a bird hits? And most times it just doesn't happen. They hit windows and there's no evidence left whatsoever. And a great example of what happens when scavengers quickly get them and take them off for a little snack. A chipmunk there taking off an American goldfinch that hit a window. So pretty common. What we've seen in a lot of nature stores are these silhouettes in windows. And I can assure you that the silhouettes don't really do anything. Birds don't recognize them as scary hawks and say, oh no, there's a hawk in that window. I better not go near it. In reality, what we need to do is basically just close up that reflective surface or break it up enough. And so the rule of thumb is to have no more than a 2x4 gap. So no more than 2 inches high or 4 inches wide for birds. If we were to use silhouettes, your window would have to look something like this, which is not ideal because then you can't really see out of it and it defeats the purpose of a window. However, there are a lot of really great alternatives to this that are inexpensive and easy to apply. One is a product called Feather Friendly, and it's just a grid of dots across the window. This is actually my home, our research station in southeastern Ohio, and I have Feather Friendly applied to all of the windows in our house. When we first got this place, I think we were there for just a couple days. Day 2, a red-bellied woodpecker hit the window. Fortunately, it survived, but I quickly made sure that I got Feather Friendly on all of those windows. The nice thing about these products compared to, say, the silhouettes is that you can still see out your windows. They really don't disrupt the visibility or your enjoyment of feeding stations. So this photo was taken 2 or 3 years ago when there was an eruption of evening grosbeaks in Ohio. Really great winter bird that hasn't come to Ohio in big numbers in decades. And that was, I don't get too many life species in Ohio, and that one was a life bird for me. I was able to get really great photos of evening grosbeak in my backyard there, and these dots on the window didn't impede that at all. So there are a lot of great solutions for the homeowner and commercial applications too for existing windows, existing glass. And the American Bird Conservancy has an entire database on their website devoted to this. There's also information there for products for new construction as well. It's actually better to include permanent bird-safe glass in new construction because the cost is lower and it's a one-time fee. For films and applications, the sun breaks them down over time. So things like Feather Friendly are generally rated to last about 10 years. But you can imagine if you're treating a lot of glass, it can get quite expensive. We had a really big win today that was just announced in the news, Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse in Cleveland, so the Cleveland Cavaliers Stadium. If you know what that looks like, it's basically a glass cube right off of Lake Erie. It is the deadliest building that I think we have in Ohio so far, and we've been working with them for a few years on what to do there, and they're going to treat that entire north facade with a product called Bird Divert, which is similar to Feather Friendly, but it's a UV product. So it's a little bit more invisible to the human eye, but birds have an extended visibility range. They can see in the infrared and ultraviolet, near infrared and ultraviolet. And so it sort of is in that ultraviolet spectrum that birds can see it. So we're really excited about that. That was a big win for us. That was a long time coming. So the next is native plants, and I know that's probably the hook that got you all here in the first place. And so first we're going to look at our windows, and now we can create all this gorgeous habitat in our backyards. And so we know, and I don't need to preach on this, you all know the trends in lawns and manicured lawns and basically what our habitats look like at this point. Sort of going back to that photograph of what a bird-friendly yard looks like and seeing that feeder station put right in the middle of a perfectly manicured lawn, that's what most people have to deal with. Unfortunately, these yards or these lawns provide very few resources for native and migratory birds. And what we need to do is put native plants in place of those. And I'll get into some of these details from a colleague of mine who actually did her master's degree here at OSU and then did her PhD collaborating with Doug Tallamy. I know it's a name that most of you are probably very familiar with. On chickadee populations in urban landscapes. And so Desiree is a really wonderful researcher. She worked in urban systems here in Columbus before she moved out east, and she's now in the Northeast working as a research scientist. So why do we stress so much on natives? The main reason is really insects. So I mentioned earlier that during the breeding season, and even now during migration, most birds aren't eating berries. They're going after insects. And in eastern North America, you'll find that we're getting concentrations of migratory birds. So a lot of the birds that breed throughout boreal Canada and Alaska are actually coming up through the eastern United States, not the western United States, because we've got all these really lush broadleaf temperate forests here that leaf out early. Those forests means we got lots of caterpillars, and that's lots of food for birds to make that journey. Turns out that about more than 90% of plant-eating insects are specialists. And so, we know some of these sort of very common associations like milkweed and monarch, but it turns out that most of our native insects are actually sort of host-specific, and they need very specific native plants as well. So if we're passionate about the conservation of migratory bird populations, we ought to be passionate about the populations of native insect populations, which means we ought to be passionate about the populations of native plant populations. That native part is really important because of that host association. And when we summarize sort of populations of birds, so if we lump them into groups where insects are an essential part of their diet or insects are not essential, we see this vast difference in the change in their populations. And so this is the average change per species in millions. And so for species where insects are an essential part of their diet, they're declining, and they're declining rapidly. It's a smaller group where insects are not essential. Think of species like goldfinch. That's a great example of one that they don't actually eat that many insects. In fact, they breed much later than most songbird species because they time the fledging of their young with the availability of seeds like Niger or thistle and other things. And so there's this vast difference. So again, we need to take a close look at this. In Desiree's work, Dr. Narengo found that Carolina chickadees preferred breeding in yards with more native plants. The nestlings actually grew faster and were in better condition in yards with more native plants. And that Carolina chickadee pairs fledged more young in yards with native plants. And so native plants means we've got healthier populations of birds. They're able to grow faster and fledge young. And I'll get to this in a little bit, but this has carryover effects, and we'll talk about what that means. So it's not just a snapshot in time. What happens now may affect the rest of that bird's life trajectory. Whether or not it takes them longer to grow, they don't migrate as early, maybe. It takes them a little bit longer. That means they're not getting to the wintering grounds first. Some songbirds are actually territorial on the wintering grounds, meaning they might get to poorer quality habitats by the time that they're there. So there are a lot of these types of effects. And Desiree found that really if we want to have healthy native yards, we need about 70% native biomass for these populations. So what does that mean for our yards? And so if we take a 1/4 acre yard, which is probably big for some of us. I know my yard here is just a tiny little fraction of that. But for, we'll say, a quarter-acre yard, you actually need 4 large trees about 20 inches in diameter, which is a decent-sized tree, 7 to 8 medium-sized trees, about 10 inches in diameter, so we're talking that big around, and 15 to 16 small trees and shrubs, about 4 inches in diameter. So your yard basically needs to be a jungle to support healthy bird populations. And this is sort of a great step on the way, or a good example of what that looks like. And again, diversity is really important, especially if we want to think about things like resilience. There are not only a lot of non-native and invasive insects, but plants, or insects as well. And sometimes, we have invasions of insects. I know spotted lanternflies now in Ohio. That's something that we're likely going to be dealing with in a few years. And so for many of these invasives, they sometimes have a smaller suite of species that they attack. And if we have a lot of diversity, it means we have a more resilient yard if something happens to one of those species. And so here are a few shrubs and small trees that are great for birds that I recommend. So hackberry is a really wonderful one, especially if you've got a little bit larger of a yard and you've got some trees. This is a small sort of mid-story tree. Persimmon's a great one. Red elderberry, viburnum as a group is wonderful. Lots and lots of native insects on these viburnums. Dogwoods, not just flowering, but a lot of our native dogwoods are excellent native plants, not only for the host insects that they provide, but also these fruits are really great as well. Things like gray dogwood and silky dogwood in the western Lake Erie Basin, the marshes there. Blackpoll warblers, what we're just finding out now is that they sort of come to that area, specifically in Lake Erie, fatten up on all the dogwoods that are there, and then head out to the Atlantic coast. And if you know anything about blackpoll warbler migration, they actually make most of their fall migratory journey over the Atlantic Ocean to Brazil. And so in order to do that, they need to really fatten up. And they do that from the dogwoods that are in our marshes in the western Lake Erie Basin. Turns out it's globally important. Virginia creeper is another great one. I know this is one that can get out of hand and some people get a little wheezy about, but it's wonderful. It provides a lot of great fruits that holds on the vine, that is available during the wintertime. And let's face it, it's pretty gorgeous in the fall. It turns bright red and is a really wonderful plant to have in your yard. We could go on and on again, and I am not necessarily a plant specialist. I am an ornithologist, so I can't answer all of your questions. Many of you probably know more about some of these plants than I do. But there are some really great resources. USDA has a plants database where you can look at specific areas of the country and find out what is locally native there, and they'll make recommendations. National Audubon Society has a really great tool as well where you can type in your zip code, and they will give you a list of plants that are sort of endemic or native to that region. So native has a whole host of meanings. So is it historically native to an area specifically, like central Ohio? Because there's a difference between a plant that's native to eastern North America and a plant that's native to central Ohio. So sometimes that can make a difference. And this tool will give a lot of really great recommendations for that. Yep. Yeah, you can spend a lot of time selecting the types of plants that you want, whether it's grasses, shrubs, trees, vines. It's a really, really valuable resource. And sometimes they'll even connect you with a local Audubon chapter, which sometimes has local nurseries as well if you're interested in that type of information. All right, so this kind of goes hand in hand with that, and it's talking about pesticides. Oops. We, as humans, have some fetish with pesticides. We use a whole lot of it. More than 1 billion pounds of pesticides are applied in the US annually. Again, we could spend an entire lecture or semester just on pesticides. It's too much to talk about here. I will say that OSU Extension is having a webinar next week. I'll be presenting some of it, but Hardy Kern from the American Bird Conservancy, who's their pesticides director, will be talking. And it's a really great one. So if you're interested in that, you can talk to me afterwards, and I can tell you about that. It's through OSU's Woodland Stewards program. And there's a significant decline with aerial insectivores and linking that to pesticide applications. So eastern whippoorwill, how many people have heard eastern whippoorwill in their lifetime? How many people have heard it in the last 10 years? No one raised their hand there. Yeah, this species has declined dramatically across North America. And it turns out that moths are the big reason why. We have a few research projects right now active, some graduate students working on eastern whippoorwill research. And we're finding that moths are really the answer for this species. And so, there's a lot of mechanisms for chemical effects on birds. So one is ingestion, dermal or inhalation, and then interaction with plants. There are plants, as you know, on the market that have pesticides built into them. They're sort of grown naturally with that. And there's a potential for that to trickle down to bird populations. And so not only is it important to get native where you can, but also ask questions about whether they were, actually have pesticides built into them or not. And so I want to get into carryover effects just slightly. We could get a little nerdy with this a bit. So this infographic is actually illustrating carryover effects of climate change. There's been a lot of really great research with this species, which is American redstart, with folks in our lab and collaborators at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Institute working in Jamaica and seeing how those sort of carryover effects happen. And it turns out that climate change impacting overwintering grounds affects habitat quality. And this species is highly territorial on the wintering grounds. And drastic changes in the availability of habitat there means that they're leaving certain areas of the wintering grounds later because they're not able to fatten up, meaning some populations are getting to the breeding grounds earlier. And we see this difference where individuals coming from certain areas that have lower quality habitats are getting there later. They're not competing for good breeding habitat. They're not finding a mate. And so this can carry over and sort of have these trickle-down effects that actually snowball throughout the individual's life. And there's been recent research showing that there are a lot of similar carryover effects with chemical exposure as well. So this is out of Bridget Stutchberry's lab. If you are a bluebirder or like purple martins, you may have heard her name before. She does a lot of purple martin research. She's based in Pennsylvania. And they did a study where they took white-crowned sparrows, so this gorgeous bird, which is just showing up through Ohio now. So this is another one that you might be able to see soon. And they actually gave them small doses of neonicotinoid insecticides. And all the birds had nanotags on them, or modus transmitters. And so there's a network of towers across the Americas and throughout Europe that are automated. And so a bird carrying this tag can get picked up by these towers. And they found that there were pretty substantial carryover effects based on the dosing. And so I won't get into too much of the details there, but these were all single doses. So any individual bird in their lifetime is likely going to encounter more than a single dose of chemical. And this was through a single dose. And for those with food consumption, they saw white-crowned sparrows that received a single high dose had significantly lower food consumption and lower change in body fat, meaning they were not able to fatten up to make that migratory journey, which means they're going to hang around later. They might experience more cold weather. We're going to get to overwintering habitat later, and we're going to see this trickle down throughout that individual's life. And so really important research there showing the effects of chemicals on birds. So, as we manicure our landscape more and more, there's a requirement, and even through our agricultural practices, as we sort of intensify and extensify agriculture, it turns from small family farms to more large-scale industrial agriculture, we need more chemical application on there because we don't have a lot of really great natural alternatives to it. Well, integrated pest management is a really great alternative, and there's been some really wonderful research showing positive impacts of that. A colleague that I work with a lot, Julie Jedlicka, who's based out of Missouri, did her doctoral research in California vineyards, showing that by just placing Western bluebird boxes in these vineyards, they actually found a 50% increase in avian insectivore species richness. So they were drawing other species as well, not just the bluebirds. They found 2.4 times more live beet armyworms were removed. And so this is a group of caterpillars that a lot of agriculture folks get really up in arms about because they can do quite a bit of damage. Many of them are native, but they can do quite a bit of damage. But they found that just having the birds there did the trick, and that there were actually 3.5 times more larval removal rates in areas where they placed bluebird boxes. And so for those bluebirders out there, keep doing what you're doing. It's really great. And there are lots and lots of examples of this. We can think about, actually, in this study, they actually removed some of the farmland and created sort of small oases of habitat within the agricultural system. And they found that that actually improved the growth rates of their product outside of those areas because it was attracting more birds who were not harming their crops. They were actually controlling the insects that were doing damage to their crops. And so integrated pest management has a lot of potential, and we can think about that in our yards as well. And so if we create really great habitat for birds, we don't necessarily need to have a lot of chemical input into the landscape. And so I encourage you to help birds help us, all right? Let's think about that and think a little bit more holistically about our yards and our habitat. And lastly, this is just icing on the cake, but there's a lot of recent research showing that in urban spaces, your yard, the greener it is and the more tree space, more tree canopy cover there is, can actually mitigate the effects of climate change. And so you can do a whole lot by having a really native yard. So look back at that recommendation of that 70% native cover or biomass in our yards. Think about planting trees in your yard. Be a little bit wise about how big your yard is and what species and their root structures that you're putting in there, because some tree species like to really throw down the roots. And so you need to think about your space wisely, but there are a lot of really great solutions. So if you're interested in more of the bird synthesis end of things, you can get a lot of resources on our website at obcinet.org. And all of our partners within the network are listed there as well. So a lot of the Audubon chapters, American Bird Conservancy, Nature Conservancy, that have a lot of these resources as well. And so if we have any time, I'd be happy to entertain questions if folks have them.
Yeah. And access all of these. Yes. I just wanted to let everyone know. Oh, thank you for the plug. Yeah, we're recording this. It'll be on YouTube. Thank you. Can I mic you? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was just curious if you knew, have you happen to know why stink bugs have become so much more prevalent? It's an interesting bug, and it's become, there was the ladybugs, the Japanese.
Yes.
But now it's stink bugs.
Yeah, they can be somewhat cyclical, and I don't know much about their host interactions, but it seems like they've been more numerous in recent years. I know I get lots of stink bugs. And lots of the Japanese beetles as well, which we put here intentionally and are very different. But I'm not really sure why we have more of those. I suspect some of it has to do with the changing climate and how winter cycles are changing a little bit. But I can't answer that for certain.
Are there birds that eat stink bugs, or because they're non-native?
They
not
will.
Interested in them?
Not as much. Smell isn't super important for a lot of birds, and so they do get consumed. Probably not as juicy as a moth caterpillar right now, but they do get eaten, yeah. Yes.
I have a question, sorry, about light.
Yeah.
it would be great to, so my neighbors have a light that was put in, I think, by the city in their alley because they're worried about crime. It is so bright. It is like it's like bright in our house, and I have neighbors who have security lights that are like way far away, and they're like, I can like do like shadow animals on the wall of my living room from their security lights, you know. What is the recommendation for security lights? I know we have the Bexley police are always saying things like, you know, have outdoor lights, you know, harden the target, and security lights keep crime away. And I see an increase in like just the strength of the security lights around right now. And they bother me, and I'm sure they bother the birds.
Oh, yeah, yes, absolutely. So your observation is very on point. I mean, we're seeing more lights and brighter lights. With LED technology, it's cheaper to throw a bunch of lights out there. They use less resources, so they're just cheaper all around. And they tend to be higher in the frequency spectrum, and so they are much brighter. The recommendation, you know, I'm not advocating, you know, safety lights are important, and we need them where we need them, but all lighting should be shielded. We desperately need to move away from unshielded lighting. So shielding is the sort of covers on top that direct light at what it is intended to light. So we have to ask ourselves, what are we trying to illuminate with those lights? It's most likely the sidewalks or streets in front of that area. It isn't Sally's bedroom. So that's really important. So the recommendation should always be shielded lighting as much as possible. Where we can put things on motion detectors, let's do that as well. Also be mindful about the color temperature that we're using as well. So more muted, lower frequency colors are a bit better. Yeah, I mean, for birds, it doesn't make that much of a difference, but I mean, there are lots of reasons why dark skies are important. Insect populations, our own psychological health. We evolved in dark skies. Having light on a 24-hour cycle is not healthy for us either. And so the recommendation is, you know, there's been a lot of mixed results in terms of birds and what part of the spectrum is less detrimental. And we like to generalize, and there are lots of different birds, lots of different bird groups, and they have different visibility and can see in different color spectra. So the recommendation is just to switch to shielded lighting as much as possible and really illuminate the thing. More light isn't going to make it safer necessarily, if you will. So, you know, working with our communities and elected officials to make sure that that is shielded as much as possible will be really important. And the International Dark Sky Association has a lot of great resources and recommendations for working with communities on those types of issues. I mean, some communities actually have ordinances in where lighting has to be shielded, and if there is enough creep, it actually is against the law to do that. So, I mean, one way around is actually work directly with your community in order to get those sorts of ordinances in place so that you're not necessarily having to play the bad cop. It's like, well, it's the rule. And they have to actually enforce that. And so that's another way to do it, because sometimes one-on-one conversations, like talking to your neighbor about all the cats that they feed on their porch, can be a tricky subject that will sometimes get things thrown at you. Yeah, supervised. I have friends that will hang out in the yard and the cat is on a leash. Yeah, that's great. I would love to put my cat on a leash if she would have it, but there's no way she's having it. I've tried, trust me. Yes.
Are you aware of any municipalities or countries that have banned outdoor cats? I feel like it's such a good idea.
Yeah.
The Society also recommends it, but
Yes, there are some European countries and also the US. You go to South America, and yes, free roaming dogs are everywhere, but we don't allow that, yet somehow cats get a pass. Neither are native to North America. It is primarily a human problem that we need to address. And again, I say this as a cat lover. I have roommates, and people say, well, the cat's unhappy inside. And I tell people, if the cat is unhappy inside, that means you're just a crappy roommate. You need to be a little bit better of a roommate, and then your cat will live a pretty awesome life.
It's not safe to have cats outside that are declawed either. They cannot defend themselves.
Even a cat with claws. I mean, I live in Clintonville, and I can't imagine letting my cat outside. It would get run over immediately. So. Yeah, all the time. I see cats. We have a lot of free-ranging cats in our neighborhood, unfortunately, and so many of them have injuries, and they just look miserable most of the time. So.
Oh, sorry, that's okay. For people who want their cats to still be allowed to go outside but are concerned about birds, I don't have a cat. Yeah. Would putting a bell on the collar, does that help birds or not so much?
Not really. It can sometimes reduce, but there's been a lot of really great research where they've actually strapped cameras on cats to follow them around, and people will claim, not my cat. Well, first of all, everybody claims that cat usually to be their cat for cats that are left outside. It's amazing what some of that research has shown, that those cats will go from door to door eating full meals at each of them, and even with full bellies, that doesn't stop their innate desire to play and hunt. They might not consume the bird, but they're going to kill it. Or they might not, it could be a chipmunk, it could be a native shrew. The impact to small mammal populations, native mammal populations, is pretty dramatic as well. So no, if you really want to let the cat outside, I would say leash or catio.